just mention the VC. Just the VC.
Just a bit,
Okay.
yeah, from different other places. Yeah. I was thinking we might have other teachers or students who will come, but let me introduce your PowerPoint. Professor Maple Razsa, I want to thank Karen Friedman for introducing him to us. Karen Friedman has recently become a Chinese citizen.
I heard that.
You heard that?
Yeah.
You better follow it. But Professor Maple Razsa is an associate professor and the director of global studies at Colby College, Maine.
Take it down.
His work explores the lived experience and political imaginations of contemporary social movements. And he was trained as a filmmaker and anthropologist at Harvard University. He has conducted many fieldworks with outer globalization protesters and anarchist punk structures, migrant labor organizers, video activists, and most recently opponent and transgressors of the European border regime. I believe he will be talking about this today, the Balkan Route. And he is here also participating in the film International Ethnographic Film Festival just past few days. The theme of the festival is visions of sovereignty, and so he has been invited to present his documentary, The Maribor Uprising, a live participatory film. And I believe in the film festivals, many of them did similar things to present alternative modes of activist movement, and relational documentaries or film together with conversation and participation and interactions and so on. So according to this introduction, the audience would need to choose which camera they would follow, because there might be multiple perspectives and footage. And also they would join, whether they would join actual uprisings or decide whether to join non-violent protests or to follow the crowd toward different places. So today he will be talking about insurgent mobilities, movement upon movement, refugee and activist struggle to open the Balkan route to Europe. Together with this talk, he will give or has given two other talks, I guess, of Daniel Seneca, a radical experiment with ethnographic form, live interactive documentary. And the other one will be Postures of Utopia. That sounds interesting. Yeah. And all right. So I'll leave the rest because there is still this introduction to your talk, but I don't want to give false impression of. I'll leave the rest to you. Please join me to welcome him. I think he still suffers the jet lag, and they started from very early morning, like 7 or 9 in the morning till midnight, viewing all the films and discussions, and couldn't sleep well and everything. And waiting 2 hours.
Trying to lower expectations.
No, take your time.
Okay. Thank you so much, Chris. And thanks for having me here at the center and the university. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to talk about these ideas in a different setting and to see how some of these ideas travel or how they need to be adjusted and challenged and changed in a new setting. As Joyce said, my research has been on social movements primarily and questions of the radical political imagination, mostly in the former Yugoslavia, but because I've really looked at transnational forms of organizing and transnational forms of political imagination, it's led me to travel quite a bit beyond the former Yugoslavia as well. So I'm relatively new to migration studies, and I think one of the unusual and maybe provocative things that I'll do is take some of the questions from social movement studies and activism and try to translate some of them into the field of migration. Oh, should I speak into the microphone? Is it hard to hear me? Of course. All right, is that better? So try to translate some of those ideas into the sphere of migration studies and ask even if we can think of some forms of migration, some forms of mobility as themselves a social movement and what the implications of that might be. I am collaborating with this larger project with Nadia El-Shaarawi. That's why I've added her name to the title. And I'm going to speak in the name of we because we've really done a lot of this research together. And I'll tell you a little bit more about her research later as I describe this larger project. And just a couple of small clarifications before I begin on terminology. I'm going to use, by and large, the term people on the move rather than migrants or refugees for a couple of reasons. The first is empirical. The Balkan route that I'll describe more was a clandestine route that included, and I'm looking at people before they have been sorted by the state into these different categories. So it seems inappropriate to, in advance, start to categorize them myself. So empirically, this is a very mixed flow of people in a lot of different conditions. And we're going to see that the talk I give today about Ahmed, that Ahmed is himself actually already a legal resident in Europe who's making this clandestine journey. So it really is a very complex, mixed flow of people. But the other reason to speak of people on the move is political, and that is to insist on people's humanity prior to their legal status. So in that sense, I'm taking inspiration from Black scholars who've insisted that we don't talk about slaves, but rather enslaved people, and so in a similar sense, I'm talking about people on the move rather than. I may use migrants occasionally because people on the move becomes cumbersome after a while, but I'll use that in an inclusive way. That means all it's just a shorthand for people on the move then when I say that. I'll try to, because English isn't everyone's first language, of course, I'm going to try to speak a little bit more slowly than I usually do. If I forget, please feel free to ask questions and slow me down. I've been here showing this film, which is an experiment in interactive film, so you actually stop the film at different points and discuss and argue about how the film should proceed. And I'd be happy to have this talk be a bit more like that too. So if you're confused or if things aren't clear, I really welcome you posing questions even along the way, and I'll tell you if I'm going to get to that soon and we should discuss it now, but please ask questions. So the title of the talk I'll actually give today is Ahmed, the Megaphone, and the Assembly of New Political Subjects, which is part of this larger Insurgent Mobilities project, and I will situate this specific set of events in the context of the larger Balkan Route and this research project. So on September 14th, 2015, the Orban administration's long campaign against people on the move reached its climax. Declaring the southern border barrier complete, Hungarian authorities sealed crossings with Serbia. Go to this map for a little bit of clarification. So they closed This Balkan route at this point in September of 2015 was going this way. This route comes later. And the town I'm going to keep talking about, Roske, is right here at the Serbian-Hungarian border, all right? You can see that a little bit more closely here as we zoom in. So it's this crossing right here. We've got this is Hungary, Serbia here. Hungary continues all the way across here, and then this is Croatia. That will become relevant later. I'll come back to that. With thousands of Syrians, Iraqis, Afghans, and others traveling the Balkan route daily to Western Europe, an encampment quickly sprouted at this Roske-Horgosh border crossing. And within 48 hours, there were thousands of people gathered at this now closed border. So there were, many of them were sleeping rough or in self-organized encampment of multicolored tents adjacent to the 4 meter tall barrier that had been built along the entire border. The assembly requested, then pleaded, and finally angrily demanded that the riot police open the border. Accounts differ regarding what sparked the physical confrontations. Soon, however, heavily armored police units deployed pepper spray, tear gas, and water cannon against an assembly that included a substantial presence of children and elderly. Then a cadre of mostly young men improvised weapons, enacted postures, and adopted tactics familiar from the Arab Spring and the wider series of the urban uprisings that they're associated with. 11 protesters would later be arrested and criminally prosecuted with attempting to enter Hungary illegally. And one man, a Syrian in his early 40s, would also face terrorism charges and receive an 11-year prison sentence. At his trial, the prosecutor would enter photo and video evidence that showed Ahmed H. speaking into a megaphone during the tense standoff. Pivotal to the prosecution's case was the allegation that with his address, Ahmed directed the assembly to attack the border, and it was even alleged that this was a migrant invasion of Hungary. There was also a matter which I'll come back to that Ahmed H., and this is Ahmed H. actually. He has the microphone in front of him so you can't see it, but he's addressing the police, and he's turning back and forth between the police and the large assembly. But there was a question about a sign that he gave, like this, which I'll talk about, which in the court proceedings they alleged was a threat to the Hungarian state. In this paper, we want to ask a series of critical, even provocative questions emerging from the charges that were laid out against Ahmed H. Questions that probe the political character of the assembly that stood opposite this barrier, the assembly that faced off against the anti-terror police at Roske. Who was Ahmed H. addressing? Was the assembly at the border a political assembly? Before we can even begin to ask these critical questions, however, we want to acknowledge the constraints, even the risks, involved in such queries at this historical moment. How to discuss the politics of migration in the face of far-right anti-immigrant discourse, and it's worth noting that globally, a lot of far-right anti-immigrant politicians have taken inspiration from what came to be known as the Hungarian solution, which I'll talk about more. And Trump has modeled many of his policies on Orban's policies and taken inspiration from them, which when I get into more detail, I'll talk about that. How does one analyze the assembly at the border and theorize what kind of collective subject it might embody in the face of right-wing rhetoric that traffics in collective metaphors of migrant floods, surges, and increasingly invasions? Liberal analysis, on the other hand, tends to criticize the politicization of migration, it often adopts instead a humanitarian discourse, emphasizing the extreme need, precarity, and vulnerability of refugees, or rebuts specific anti-immigrant talking points. It'll illustrate how refugees and migrants benefit host societies, assertion for which there's significant evidence, of course. Scholars of mobility, for their part, frequently criticize the use of collective metaphors for migration by the far right, the press, and other scholars. Should I go a little slower, or is this okay so far? It's okay? All right, thanks. So those scholars criticize those metaphors, rightly emphasizing how these metaphors have been used to dehumanize people on the move and stoke fears about migration. So what we find here then is as Miriam Tickton has argued in her article Beyond Humanitarian Borders, that, quote, it seems the only subject position available to those of us who are not trying to build fences or walls is to be humanitarian, end quote. And it's worth just remembering, of course, what the dangers of a strictly humanitarian approach are, right? They tend to depoliticize, they tend to treat the objects of humanitarian assistance as passive victims, right? And that's that, and those who offer it for them to be the exclusive agents, right? We propose here instead to follow the struggles of people on the move beyond this impasse, to follow them to a space in which another politics of mobility can be contemplated. We therefore ask, in what came to be known as the Razsa riots, and in the broader Balkan Route, take as the Balkan Route that entire, this, basically, so the Balkans being this peninsula, right? So we're taking especially this section of the struggle for mobility, but I'll describe that more when I get to it. But we want to argue that you can recognize in both the riots and in the broader route a movement against borders, even an insurgent mobility. And if so, what kind of collective subject is formed in transit and at moments of migratory immobilization? People are when their mobility is blocked. Who, in other words, did Ahmed H. address with the megaphone? Who is the we that he invokes when he declared to the police that, quote, we came here in peace, just pass? What kind of we-ness can we understand to be present in this assembly? Is there something more? Is there something a grounds of commonality, and is there a grounds of politics that we can recognize? Is there a kind of a we-ness there? We'll offer some initial speculation on these assemblies formed at Razsa and consider the possibility that a radically plural political subject was formed en route. After all, the Razsa riots took place at the intersection of multiple journeys of diverse people on the move. On finding themselves immobilized, their demands for open borders and the protest tactics that they took up are recognizable from other movements, echoing not only the struggles in other places along the Balkan Route or the Arab Spring, which I've mentioned, but also echoed in caravans from Central America to the US and the Palestinian March of Return in Gaza. And I'm organizing, the next anthropology meetings, I'm bringing together scholars who are working on these different struggles in Gaza, at the US southern border, and in Europe, to have a sort of dialogue about whether we can recognize across these different terrains movements against borders, which is the title of that. I want to offer just a couple of clarifications about this approach before I outline the overall argument that I'll make here today. First, if it's not already clear, we reject on both empirical as well as political grounds the prosecutor's claim that Ahmed led an invasion of Hungary. those immobilized at the Hungarian border did not seek to invade Hungary. They demanded rather the right to cross Hungary, right? Almost none of them hoped to stay in Hungary. We can return to why that might matter, but I think it matters in this case in part because we get one of the clearer cases of what's at stake is mobility first and foremost. There are other border struggles that happen when people arrive in their destinations and continue to struggle against other forms of bordering. But even though this is only a demand for movement, a claiming of even a right to mobility, it nonetheless is a struggle that becomes antagonistic to what Lisa Malki has called the national order of things, right? And it's a challenge to the Hungarian state's monopoly on deciding who has access to its territory, right? Now, I don't mean by saying that this is a struggle against borders, I don't mean to claim that the people involved necessarily had anti-state or anti-border ideologies, that those were ideas that they necessarily espoused. I did meet people along the route who had been politicized by their experiences and the humiliations and indignities that they faced struggling to move. And many of these journeys went on, 3, 4, 5 years, some of them, from Afghanistan to Europe. And some of them were multiple journeys where people had been deported repeatedly and were coming again. I say that they don't have but most of them don't have anti-state or anti-border explicit ideas. After all, most of them were seeking inclusion in wealthy states of Western Europe was their goal. They were hoping to reach there, and we can presume that many of them, once they did get there, like many immigrants before them, might have wanted to close the door behind them. This isn't necessarily a fundamental struggle against borders. I was reminded of this. There was just a large rally a few weeks ago in Texas by Indian Americans and Indian permanent residents and workers in Texas that was called the Howdy Modi gathering, and it was in support of Modi, and Trump made an appearance at that as well, and it was a declaration of support for Trump. So you had immigrants supporting Trump's anti-border policies. Despite those caveats, nonetheless, we're arguing that when people struggling to reach Western Europe find themselves immobilized, when they find themselves at odds with bordering practices, their struggles do become anti-border struggles. This is true whether they surreptitiously follow a footpath through a cluster of trees at a so-called green border, or if they are involved in one of the many collective marches of hope taken under the slogan, "Open the border." Okay, just give you a quick sense of the parts of this talk and where I'm headed from here going forward. I want to first just quickly review the history of the Balkan Route and how it was opened and its geography briefly. Then, and because we're taking that Balkan Route as our object of study, I'll introduce you a bit to the larger Insurgent Mobilities project and where this paper fits in that larger project. Give an overview of this Hungarian solution to migration and the riots against it. And then hone in on the case of Ahmed H. himself and see what that tells us about the political character of mobility. And in conclusion, we'll offer some speculative reflections on how the Razsa riots show us the collective and political character of border struggles and the wider route. Any questions so far? All right. couple of these are a couple of pictures from the riots. So here he is addressing them, and I'll describe what happened in those protests in more detail later, but here's a few images. I included this one because using this tent as a shield from the water cannon sort of reminded me of, there were sort of, I could hear the rhymes or see the rhyming of Hong Kong in this image a bit. All right, so the Balkan Route from below. In the summer of 2015, a series of border struggles, and I take this idea from Geneva and others, and I'll talk about it a bit more below, but a series of border struggles utterly disrupted the EU border regime, upending the system of managing and immobilizing migration far from Europe's wealthiest states, and throwing the Union into political crisis. The Balkan Route was opened by massive undocumented crossing of people on the route, people on the move from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and many other states. They were departing from the Turkish coast, and the majority were going to Kos or Lesbos, which is right here. And then from there they would go by ferry, and then many of them actually walked overland in various size groups up through. But this was very fluid and changing, and I'll try to give a little bit more detail to that. But they were opened by these crossings into in the eastern Aegean in these rubber boats that you see here, and the route was extended northward and westward through collective struggles to press through police lines at the Macedonian border and at the and then subsequently at the Hungarian border they pressed through police lines as well, and this culminated this struggle to open the route with the March of Hope, in which refugees set off from Budapest. Here they are landing on Lesbos. This is crossing at Macedonia. This is also at the Greek-Macedonian border. And this is the March of Hope. So as I said, this sort of struggle to open the borders culminated in the March of Hope, in which people on the move set off for Budapest on foot. Set off from Budapest for Austria on foot. And they did this after they were denied access to trains for multiple days. They're having taken over the highway from Budapest towards Austria. The Balkan Route cut through each of the physical barriers and state policies developed to manage and curtail migration to Europe and to keep migrants offshore or far from Europe's core. This is usually talked about as the European border regime, right? Which in many ways, like the U.S.'s, has taken inspiration from the Australian solution of holding people at great distance on islands, right, far from Australia. Soon, between 3,000 and 10,000 refugees were entering the European Union per day. And while many have praised German Chancellor Angela Merkel's decision to welcome the refugees, she made this decision when refugees were already arriving en masse, and it appeared that only the most extreme and potentially violent and embarrassing measures would prevent their entry into Germany. And so it's worth remembering that the decision to welcome, especially Syrian, but for a while the entire open flow. We can talk about how the route was closed, what measures were taken. You learn a lot from how the border regime works through seeing it suspended and then reimposed, which we can talk about. But Merkel, on the day we see this image, actually, on the 7th of September 2015, so a week before the Razsa riots, Merkel met with her Minister of the Interior and asked, can you make sure that we can keep these people out of Germany without producing images of German police brutalizing refugees? Given the German history, we can't have those images. usually the violence of the borders had been being carried out much further away, but now people have managed to reach close. So it's at that moment and under the pressure of this march that she decides to suspend the enforcement of what's known as the Dublin rules, which we can talk about, but which effectively meant that people could reach Europe. It took nearly 7 months for the EU to restore the border regime, at which point 1.2